Welcome to the School of Architecture. My name is Jean-François Bédard. If you don't know me, I'm assistant professor of architectural history here at school, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Mark Jarzombek, professor of the history and theory of architecture and associate dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Specifically because I use in my survey class Professor Jarzombek's book, and that will be the topic of tonight's talk. Covering a wide range of historical topics, Jarzombek's work questions the artificial divisions that separate the history and theory of architecture from its practice. In his work on Leon Battista Alberti, first begun in his 1986 dissertation at MIT, and in his subsequent book entitled On Leon Battista Alberti, His Literary and Aesthetic Theories, he considered Alberti's discussions of art in the totality of his written oeuvre. As a historian interested in the social context surrounding the production of theory, Jarzombek sought to overcome the modern separation of ethics and aesthetics and the disciplinary fragmentation that conditioned much of Albertian scholarship. The Alberti that emerges from Jarzombek's analysis hardly matched the tired figure of the Apollonian Renaissance man. He sees instead in Alberti a masterful author that manipulated late medieval rhetoric to pursue his idiosyncratic, often ironic enterprise. His second book, The Psychologizing of Modernity, Art, Architecture, and History, Jarzombek explores the figure of the modern self and its impact on architecture. In this dense and ambitious work, he studies the construction of subjectivity in architectural history, a process he terms historiography. He addresses the tense relationship between scholarship and the psychologized space of avant-gardist creativity, one that stresses life as experience to the detriment of methodological knowledge. He shows that both aspects of architectural practice are deeply related as they each refrain from questioning their disciplinary presupposition. He proposes in their place a new model he names critical historiography. Jarzombek's critical historiography attempts to fuse the scholarly individual to the avant-gardist artist in the continuous state of bewilderment, the hallmark of the modern self. Most recently, as the freshmen in the audience will know, Jarzombek co-authored an architectural history textbook entitled A Global History of Architecture. His lecture tonight will focus on the challenges of writing a truly global history of architecture today. Please welcome Mark Jarzombek.
Thanks, Jean-François, for the introduction, and thanks for the Department of Architecture for the chance to come here and speak to you tonight. And before we get going, I just want to see the screen has somehow done something, which is not, what's up that is. Okay, sorry, sorry about that. All right. There's no doubt that we live in a global world today, and that we have to think about what that means for us as a person, us as a society, and in broader cultural terms, politically, historically, and philosophically. We've only begun to, in some sense, review our presumptions that have been inherited in this way, that have come from the 19th century, 18th century perhaps, 20th century. And in some sense, I would say the future of the global project is still very much in front of us. However, as I want to show perhaps more towards the end, I have some doubts about how this global project is developing currently. And I think that there is some reason to be concerned that in some sense the global that we might want or that I might want is not going to really happen. But I wanted to start first by giving some examples of how, if you will, the global is somewhat different than the global we might have imagined even 10 or 15 years ago. So first, if we think of how we would inform ourselves about studying architecture around the world, clearly we have a whole genre of architectural literature, such as buildings history, local histories, regional histories, national histories, geographic histories, that we would have to sort of get our hands into, read, study, peruse, and in some sense interrelate, because none of these are what we would call global history. Global history, our textbook, of course, is a global history. It's not the global history. There's no such thing. It can only be versions of it. So to get to something that looks like, acts like, sounds like, approximates something that might be global, we have to, of course, study all various different types of realities from a sort of historical and historiographic point of view. We have to look at recent archaeological events. We have to look at perhaps archaeological digs that were done in the 1920s that haven't been really thought through again. We have to interview people in different languages and different cultures. And of course, we have to go to the sites themselves and see them in their own terms. In the past, when we taught global, it was usually what I would call the Euro plus model. This is a model in which you have the standard European world, which would start somewhere in Egypt, go to Mesopotamia, wound up a lot about here in the Middle Ages, and then cut across there with the modern world. And then we would add a few chapters on China or on India or South America, the pre-Columbian Americas, and that was considered really good enough to cover the material. And this sort of model is sort of usable and not itself sort of, it's better than just a Euro model, right? At least you have the plus. And so you can sort of see, a textbook where you have the Euro world, and then you add 2 chapters on Asia and one on China and Japan. And then you've done your plus, and then you sort of move on and get back to the business of the Euro world. The other sort of model, and this is from Trachtenberg's textbook, which in the title says a Western tradition, so it's not trying to be global, but this gives us a lesson also about how we organize our information. So if you look at his titles, you realize that as natural or as normal the titles might seem at first cut, right? We have an ancient world, and we got the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and Baroque, and the modern. What could be, in some sense, particularly problematic about that? But if we look at the title like Architecture Before Greece, we sort of, might have some questions what that might mean. Clearly, Greece means a lot to Trachtenberg, but you would think maybe Egypt could be mentioned in the title. But no, so clearly the Greek world is the origin of a sort of civilizational narrative, and he doesn't want to give up on that. So we can begin to sort of say, well, after the Greeks come along and the Romans, then all of a sudden there's this big religious moment, and then after the religious moment we have an artistic moment of the Renaissance and Baroque, and then after that we have a modern world. And so we can begin to sort of see how he divides up history into origins, religions, the secular humanism, and the Enlightenment rationalism. So basically, he takes the history and embeds in it sort of a silent teleological project. And why I'm not arguing against that, we all have our sort of silent teleological projects, but this one is perhaps okay if you want to look at only the European world. But if you're looking at the global, one has to be incredibly more suspicious of these types of projects and sort of figure out how they sort of begin to operate and try to avoid certain ones, certainly like these. This was completely inoperative in anywhere but Europe, and even in Europe it might not be. And so this is another types of questions. So we decided to divide the book up according to time to sort of avoid at least the appearance of having some sort of value embedded into the structure of our text. The other type of question you can ask is, well, where do texts begin? What's the first thing that they talk about? Because this is an indication of already their implicit sort of values. So for Trachtenberg, Hyman, they start with Stonehenge. Kostoff makes the title Cave in the Sky and starts with Stonehenge as well. And the book by Johnson and Crouch starts with the Buddhist caves in India. So now, once again, this might sound, perfectly reasonable. Stonehenge is a very old building. It's really great. We should talk about it and discuss it, there's no doubt about that. But once again, when we look at how these things are framed, we sort of get a little bit nervous. For example, in the Crouch and Johnson book, they say architectural history is local history. Why is the architecture of one place different from that of anywhere else, somewhere else? Each society develops its own architectural responses to the tensions between the environment and culture. These are perfectly reasonable sentences and a very good question. And so you say, I don't see the problem. Well, one can begin to say, why are we emphasizing, for example, difference? We could say, why is architecture of one place very similar to the architecture of another place? And then we sort of have to ask, well, what is it? What is a place and what is a society? Well, is a society a valley? Is it a city? Is it maybe a region around a city? Is it sort of a region around 5 cities? Is it a nation? Well, now it gets too big now, so we got to go something smaller. All of a sudden, it's not very clear what a word like that means. Well, we use the word society too, but we're a little bit careful, I think, in trying to avoid some grand statement about what a society might be and how it develops in relationship to larger projects. We sort of use the word like state, nation. We're not afraid of talking about boundaries. The implication is that there's something that was modern, which is sort of, or civilization, and then before civilization there were these societies, and they were sort of local and natural and responded in some sense, an organic way to their existent culture, and we're somewhat skeptical of that position. So he looks at chapter 1, on the principle and going through various positions. You see form and content, and then water, shelter, and food. So the idea is that, first we came out of the primitive caves some 6 millions of years ago. And then, obviously, for him in India, by the time we get to the 2nd century, we're still in caves, which is, of course, a complete insult if you know anything about Indian architecture. So the caves that he's talking about are, first of all, not caves. They're called caves because the English, when they colonized India, looked at these things and didn't really understand them and called them caves. But just because the English thought that these wonderful pieces of rock-cut architecture are caves, doesn't mean that we should sort of continue this type of mistake. This is rock-cut architecture. It's a building. It just happens to be carved out of a mountainside. And of course, you carve it from the top down, and so it's actually an upside-down building because you can't carve from the bottom and the guy on top throwing stones on your head, right? So you got to carve this thing sort of conceptually upside down. It's very difficult to do. Really, truly an engineering, geometric, and sort of stone masonry sort of cultural type of building. So it has nothing to do with shelter. It has nothing to do with the ancient caves of thousands and thousands of years before Christ. All right, so if we can just sort of compare, we have sort of, Stone Age and then these Buddhist caves. So the question is, how do they begin? And when you look at these beginnings, you begin to sort of register here another level, if you will, of ideology, of how you sort of start the story. So these beginnings are never as innocent as they might appear. So we could start with Stonehenge, and then of course we could say that sort of sounds pretty reasonable. But in reality, Stonehenge, even by the time it was built, was one of the last of the great stone circles that one can find in the Eurasian world. There were earlier ones that are found in China, one in Africa, in the western part of Egypt from 7,000 BC. Another one recently found in Turkey, also from 7,000 BC. So these sites predate the Stonehenge. And so you can sort of see that even from that perspective, starting in Stonehenge, you're already starting at the end of a particular type of story, really, rather than the beginning. So, of course, Stonehenge comes after the pyramids, right? We think of Stonehenge as primitive. It's like you would go first from agrarian society to Stonehenge to primitive, to pyramids. But in reality, you went from some sort of agrarian society to a transition phase in Egypt two pyramids while the guys in England were doing their, Stonehenge. So we cannot sort of see this as a sort of sequential. So to start with Stonehenge really puts the cart, in some sense, before the horse. And then the other question is, how does all of this sort of imply in the context of modernism? So, in other words, even though we may have before us a book that is about history, and we think there's nothing to do with modernism until we get to the very end, basically, I think that all historians are writing in the context of modernism, or seeing modernism before them, or behind them, or in some way or other, and that basically embedded in these projects is an attitude about the modern. So for Trachtenberg and Hyman, the project of the crafting of this sort of building is in some sense something that he really admires. For Kostoff, he talks about this building as a meaningful act, which sort of contrasts with sort of other obviously not meaningful acts, which might be a contemporary corporate building. And then for Couch and Johnson, they have this sort of myth going about shelter, which sort of sounds all very reasonable, but is completely out of place in the context of architecture, I think, as we might know it, even at the earlier stages. This brings us then to the other question. When we look at global, we often hear people say, oh, I'm studying global, and I'm looking at vernacular architecture. And so, if you go to the Smithsonian site and their art history site and look at their slide collection, because you might want to sort of pick something of it, and you type in vernacular architecture, you'll get this sort of 17th century mosque that's in Mali. And you can sort of see here vernacular architecture. Well, there's some problems with that. First of all, the word vernacular itself is a problem. It's sort of used very generally today, and it's sort of not a big deal if you use it, I guess. But let's just face it, it is a Latin word, and we should know at least what the Latin word means. So if it's like the Roman rich people had slaves, and if a slave was born in their house, this was a vernaculus. And of course, that meant that the master screwed around with the pretty slave girls. And so basically these were the vernaculus kids, or who were born sort of locally in the master's house. A vernaculum was a shack at the back of the garden where these slaves lived. So you have to sort of ask yourself, why are we using this rather derogatory word? Well, if you study the use of the word, which I haven't done in complete, but a few students have, you realize that basically it wasn't used in the context of architecture until after the Second World War, and only in a few instances, very sort of arbitrarily in the early 19th century. So basically, we have a term that comes out of literally language, because the vernacular was used in the 19th century more for language than for art and architecture. And then in the after the Second World War, it slowly sort of creeps into our culture as a term available to us to describe, if you will, non-Western or primitive, or in some sense pre-modern architecture. So the two important culprits are Bernard Rudowski, the Austrian theorist who talks a lot about vernacular, who sat in the New York Public Library imagining what all these places were. He never visited any of this stuff. And of course, the American vernacular, which was published in 1985. And by that time, the word vernacular had become sort of stabilized as part of our culture. So vernacular is a big sort of problem because it definitely is, there is something out in the world, you can say, which is made by craft, without mechanical tools, by people in certain social conditions, and we want to call it something. Well, I think we should call it, we should identify it, that's for sure, but I'm not sure the vernacular is the right word. So we have certain fallacies that we sort of have to avoid when we're thinking of the global as sort of the project we want to undertake. And first is that we have to do it only by specialists in the field. This is the Euro Plus model where the professor says, I don't know anything about India. I'm really nervous. I'm going to get the names wrong. So I'm going to call in the guy down the street who knows something about India, and he's going to give this, or she's going to give the lecture on India. Well, this is perfectly fine, except that many of the specialists are used to talking to specialists and not to undergraduates or to lecturing at the context of architectural history. So they wind up talking in a very high specialist way about some archaeological dig that may not make much sense in the broader context of things. So I think we have to overcome the fact that specialists have all the right answers, and that because we're not a specialist in Chinese architecture, we can't say anything about it. It's really not all that hard. There are some things one has to learn, but any smart person and any professor who's in the field should do it. The second fallacy is that we sort of assume that there is a way of doing architecture that is not connected with the modern, and that we're going to the world outside of modernity precisely in order to uncover or unwrap, if you will, these sort of quote-unquote vernaculars, or these societies which are in touch with nature. And this, I think, is also wrong on many different accounts. Many early societies may have seemed to be in touch with nature, but the reason many don't exist today was because they were completely out of touch with nature. The Chinese began to chop down trees almost from day one, and produce large deserts that were part of a desertification process that were partially man-made. The deserts in Iraq now we are known to be largely the production of man-made desertification, when the trees in the Mesopotamian area were basically all of them sort of chopped down for fire to produce iron tools in the 9th century. And so by the year 1000 or 1200, basically the desertification of Iraq came into being, and the wonderful the wonderful Mesopotamia with its waterways and its fowl and its fishes and so forth has disappeared. So, societies have always had a very conflicted relationship with nature. Now, of course, the other fallacy is that, all of this would have been great if before modernism, before colonialism, the world, in other words, we're going to uncover, when we go to the world, the global world, a place which is sort of authentic, of real cultures, real rituals, and the like. Well, of course, these rituals and cultures do exist, and they are very real, but they also have changed. The very notion that a place has been static for thousands and thousands of years is historically inaccurate almost everywhere that you go. So for us, the first principle is to understand is that history is not static, has never been static, and certainly never will be. And that the globe, therefore, is something that's spinning in our imagination. As we sort of we begin to do the work of the historian, we have to sort of see it continuously spinning. This is why we started each chapter in a different place. Because to start each chapter in the same place would basically mean where, somehow the world has to stop and start in one place. So if the world is continually spinning, it doesn't really matter where you start, it doesn't really matter where you end, as long as one keeps on seeing the world, in some sense, as round and as moving, just as time itself and history are moving objects. So how did we start? And I'm going to then go into this a little bit more in detail. So we started with the cities, first of all, to make sure to stress the fact that already by the year 3000 BC, we had cities. We had large cities, metropolitan areas, and so we wanted to sort of engage this question of urbanism right at the beginning. So yes, there were villages, yes, there were small towns that were sort of nested in between various areas, but really, in some sense, by 3000 BC, we see cities not just in one place, but in many, many different places. And so this was, in some sense, the message that we wanted to stress. So this brings me to the question of early history. How do we sort of begin to sort of rethink now the early history of civilization? So this is a map. I'm sorry, my graphics are not very, very good, but I mean, you can sort of get the sense of what the world looked like, as your father knew it, but also not too far from how Hegel knew it. I mean, there's an interesting relationship between Hegel writing in 1820 and basically most histories up until, like 10 or 15 years ago. So you had Egypt and Mesopotamia, and everyone made a big deal about that. And somewhere over on the horizon, there was China, you see a little fuzzy. And then India, no one really talked too much about it because it seemed really strange, and unless you took a special class on Indian architecture, so it basically wasn't on the map. Certainly, I had a very good architectural history training at the ETH, And I don't think not once did we talk about India. Well, times have changed since Hegel. In the 1910s, they were building a railroad. The English were building a railroad between India and what's now Pakistan. And they discovered in the sand all these bricks. And so they didn't need to order bricks all the way from Delhi. They just sort of grubbled around in the sand and they found these bricks. And they used the bricks to make the railroad ties and to make the embankments and this and that. And they thought, this is really great. Here we're in the middle of the desert and there are all these bricks. So finally, someone happened to be on the train and said, wow, these bricks are amazing. They told him the story and happened to be an archaeologist. And he got off the train and he looked at some of these bricks and he said, these bricks are old. I mean, they were really old. I mean, they were like 3000 BC old, right? So 5,000-year-old bricks. And they said, it can't be true. There's nothing here. This is desert. Hegel didn't talk about this, so it can't be anything there. And then, of course, it's in a very uncomfortable political situation on the border between India and Pakistan, so it's hard to do archaeology there. And so they began to dig and dig and dig, and then they uncovered a fantastic story. And just to remind you the size of what we're talking about, this is France. All right, France, a lot of cities, right? And this, is what we're talking about. Gigantic area, the size of a country of France, right? Right? With cities, dozens of gigantic cities with 50,000, 100,000, right? I mean, not just little, micro villages, guys sitting in the landscape, chewing on the bark. And we know that there was this first phase of 5,000 BC, going to 3,000, so 2,000 years of sort of, let's say smallish towns and villages, more in the hills here. And that makes a lot of sense because before you can make big cities, you obviously will make towns first, and you'll want to put the grain in the valley, and you'll want to hunt in the mountain ranges, right? So you want to sort of between the grain and the hunting, that's where you want to live. But at a certain moment, you got the grain production, you've got it down pat, you know how to make grain, and you know that grain, it really goes a lot in sort of in the commerce. So you can trade grain for things that you don't have. It's a lot easier than going around hunting. So then, by 3,000 to 1,000, you see the emergence here of large-scale cities with sophisticated water drainage systems, with large swimming pools, with sewage canals, and houses that had, like bathrooms in them. I mean, unheard of technological sophistication compared to what you would find anywhere else at that time in the world. So the Indus Valley civilization all of a sudden changes the whole notion of how are we going to talk about the emergence of civilization itself. All right, so this is sort of the map. I just found this in a book, right, to show you sort of where it is. Of course, you wonder why these maps, they always show you one thing and there's like no one ever around, It's just like not, I mean, so, I always have this question. I say, like, what's wrong with this map? And no one can figure it out. Well, it's like, what's all the white space? I mean, there's millions of people in the world and they're not there. But at any rate, okay, you can sort of see where they are, right? This is the Indus, right? And we can see where Mesopotamia is over there. All right, then, about 20 years ago, these guys were in the steppe of Russia wandering around, and they saw some sticks sticking out, and they wondered what those things were, and they began to dig, right? And they noticed that there was now this gigantic culture, they call this Anthronovo, which has to do with the village, named after a village. We don't know what these people call themselves. And this now, of course, is more or less abandoned steppe. At that time, it would have been lightly forested savannas, sort of imagine, no, it's not the steppe that we see today, which is a desertification consequence that began to take place in around 1000 BC. And so this was a large area of village and mineral village society. And then a little bit later, what's called the BMAC people, and that's only just a modern name, it's not their name, we don't know what they call themselves, and they can sort of say they developed an urban, my battery's running out here, an urban sort of a nub sort of down in sort of in this side. And there are several cities who have been discovered now recently, and one of them is Gonur. Gonur consists of sort of two cities. This is one, and this is the other one just a little bit up to the north there. And, you know, I don't need to even get into the detail of how it's put together, how the palaces, how the kings and the servants' quarters and the fortification, just as you can see, this is a sophisticated city, complicated, and here are the other buildings that are part of the same sort of genre of time, right? So the Pyramid of Zoser, which is sort of one of the great buildings of all time. I just showed you Mohenjo-Daro, which is one of the great cities too far for the south. This is Gonur, more or less at the same time as Pyramid of Zoser. The Ziggurat of Ur comes online sort of at that time too. So all of a sudden now, in a place that we didn't even know had any archaeology, all of a sudden now is a center of hot archaeological activity. The Russians are very much in love with this because they're seeing this now that finally they too have an ancient city. So Putin was out there, you know, without it, digging something, you know. Hopefully nothing too important. All right, so then you have to add a few other things, right? Because these are sort of some of the big ticket items. But between all of this, right, there's lots of stuff was happening. And recent archaeology, especially in the last 10 years, has done really a tremendous amount of rethinking about what it's looking at and how it's looking at it and how it's making certain arguments. So, for example, instead of just looking sometimes at the great cities, they're starting to look at some of the technologies and technological sites, mining sites, quarry sites, and so forth. So this is a site that has recently come to bear, which was a gigantic third millennia quarry site. And here you see springs with water coming down. So it had water, of course, for the people to drink and use. And then it had this sort of technology. So it was a city designed around one income, which was quarrying stone and distributing it as far as they possibly could, right? So it's not local. I mean, they had enough stone, you know, to make the 5 or 6 little houses, right? This was not about that. This was, you know, Gary, Indiana, you know, this of stone, you know, in the 3rd millennium, right? So we have cities making specialized products, so to speak, for the building industries. And I'll show you where it's located, right? Right, so it's located pretty good, right? You have the Euphrates and you have the Tigris, right? Good water channels, right, for the distribution southward mainly, because these guys had a lot of stone in the mountains, but these guys in the south didn't have much stone, so they're desirous of stone. Now the guys who are making the stone quarry, they sort of have to eat, so of course they're buying the grain that these guys are making, right? They're buying the grain, these guys are selling stones, right? They don't have to do any grain working. So the whole introduction really of sort of commodity exchange begins, we get to sort of see that, and if we magnify that, if we couple all of these little links together, we begin to see a much more complex society than we might sort of imagine. Now part of the problem we face is that archaeology is still driven often by sort of national funding, right? So the guy in Israel who's studying Bronze Age sites, right, you see he stops right at the border, right? He's not going to step 1 inch into Jordan. Right? There's no Bronze Age sites in Jordan. Right? And the guy working in Jordan is God. He's not going to go to Israel. Right? You see all the clustered there? So what we've got to do is repair, right, these sort of inane archaeological fetishizations about the national border. Okay, he gets his funding probably from the Jordanian ministry, so he's only concerned about Jordan. He knows, of course, that there are sites in Israel. He's not an idiot, and he knows that we know, but he's not going to put them on the map, right? Right? And so we have to do the mapping, which is sort of really, why do we have to do the mapping? Shouldn't they be doing a map? You know? So a lot of the homework is like at this scale. You see, if we want to tell the story about the Bronze Age, this wonderful Bronze Age bubble, right, of urban reality, right, we wind up having to make these maps. So this is part of the struggle in working with the global, is that you encounter, yet always in some sense, sort of these sort of shafting slices of sort of the nationalist agenda, which sort of are very irritating. So if you put all of this together, and this is just sort of some of the highlights, if you will, right? The North Indian civilization, the BMAC people, the new archaeological discoveries in southern Persia and Iran, the new discoveries of specialized cities, doing one city only specialized in tar, right? because as we know, there was oil in Iraq and Iran, and this city in Iraq from the 3rd millennium BC. They would take this stuff that was bubbling up out of the sand and make it into sort of tar balls, and then they would use it as against waterproofing for their houses. So they put logs, and they would sort of put this layer of tar, right? So of course, then tar, lime, and these other commodities were sort of being shipped around. The Swat Valley now has been some interesting research, even though it's probably being delayed now for the next 100 years. Was a sort of a north-south trading center, and you can go on and on. All right, so the result is a different map than what we might sort of expect. We have a sort of an urban area here, which extends from the Indus all the way to Egypt, and through Mesopotamia, through Persia, and so forth and so forth. And then we have a village sort of zone up in the north, which specialized in metallurgy. So these guys here, and we know that bronze and gold were produced here in the Romanian highlands, in the Czechoslovakia and Austria, and then were brought down to be marketed, because these guys, they had bronze, they had metal, but they didn't have grain, right? At least not by the big tons, right? So if they wanted to get grain, they had to go down here. These guys, had grain by the bejesus, but they didn't have bronze, right? They needed bronze for jewelry, they needed bronze for decoration, they needed bronze for architecture, they needed bronze for weapons, or whatever it is. So the exchange is very strong between this sort of north and south. And so you have to then factor in this whole thing. So it's not just a question of cities, even though the cities are the huge modernization, the huge sort of drivers, if you will, of the energy, right? Because they're the mass consumers, right, of production, but they're related to the materials that come from the north, and it's not only metals, but later, in particular, the important commodity of the north is horses. Horses became, if you will, the tanks of the south, and we know, when the first horses arrive in Egypt. We know when the first horsemen begin around the year 1500 to begin to invade southward and say, well, why don't, this guy, that's pretty expensive price there for your grain, we're just going to go take it. So there's a huge disruption that begins around 1500 as these sort of barbarian horsemen come plowing north and eventually take over. Like the Hittites eventually come over and take here. They were from, maybe no one knows where they came from, but we know that they came from up north, and they landed here. The Mitannians came sort of also from over here, and so forth like that. So this is the moment before that destabilization, when around 2500, when you have this, in some sense, large geographical zone of sort of interpenetrating economies. By no means should we sort of think of it as just sort of a static history. It took, 1,000 years for it to develop, and it also then very quickly went undone, right? So if we take I didn't produce it for you, but if we took the map from 1500, what we see, this disappears completely, because what happened was, we don't really know. There are two conjectures. One was there was a big earthquake, and the river was blocked. And so the river just died. And so when the river dies, if I can go back very quickly to the map, the reason we never found it, you can see the river is a dry river, the Gakra-Hakra River. So the river disappeared, and all the cities with all the water died. I mean, because the whole water-based urbanism, right? So we're talking millions and millions of people. Where did they go? Wait, now just imagine, it's sort of like at the ecological scale, we can't even imagine that today, that we haven't had anything quite similar to that, but we have seen it on TV, with, I don't know, the Earth, or, where California falls off, there's one film where California falls off, and there's the fault that goes through, I don't know, anyway, you can imagine it sort of cinematically. Well, this happened in real time around the year 1500, and all these people went somewhere. So some went south, and another group went north, and during this time, of course, the Aryans came with their horses, and they sort of made a mess of things too for a while. And so the modern river is over here somewhere. Is it on the map? Yeah, the modern river is there, you see. Right. So there was this, that green spot basically dies off and becomes a desert and disappears basically until about 1910, right? So if this is gone, right, you can imagine the whole thing begins to fall apart, right? That's gone. These guys are invaded. The right half of this entire map sort of now goes blank. And of course, that's exactly when the Minoans start coming into power, because basically what it's not working. Is there a red dot there? All right. Anyway, Minoans, you know where they are in Crete. The left half is sort of protected from all the disruptions. And so Egypt, the Hittites, and the Minoans basically retreat into a very small package of culture at that particular time, whereas this is sort of disappears for a couple hundred years. All right. So anyway, this is going back to our map of how your fathers knew it. So we've sort of come a long way. But yet somehow we're sort of familiar with this type of story, and we have really got to, in some sense, reject these types of models. And instead, we've got to adopt a much more broader, we have to just try to imagine that already in the 2500, there was a globalness, right? Global sort of existed. It wasn't the same way. They didn't have internet. They didn't have fast speed, but they were communicating, they were talking, they were making industries, they were making specializations. Yes, the guy who lived here probably didn't know anybody who lived there. But this guy's obsidian piece was surely being sold on the market in Egypt. And the tin that was being produced here, because that was the only place where tin was being made at the time, most certainly wound its way all the way down to India, where there was no tin. So these exchanges were very powerful. And even though China is really far, and you got mountains and difficult terrain that connected the two, increasingly now they're already suggesting that there were much more contacts between China and this part of Western Asia than we sort of expect. New archaeological digs are going to prove that. So the general rule is, if we're going to find things in the future archaeologically, it's to prove that people were more connected, were better situated, had stronger economies than we had ever possibly thought in the past. This has been proved always yet again and again. Now, in the next part, I'm giving another quick sort of case study example of how we can need to rethink some of the ways in which we talk about our architecture. So the big theme is Armenia, and I just want to say I'm not Armenian, okay, just so that people think, oh, he's Armenian. No, I'm not Armenian. I'm not, okay, because we have a lot of, in Cambridge, there are a lot of Armenians. They think I'm a big hero, but it's not really, I'm not Armenian. I like Armenia, and I'm going there in summer, I'm going to look at these sites, but it's not about that. All right. But, okay, where is it? Well, you notice, right? European maps are always there's Europe. And okay, we always have Turkey on it. I mean, we know what that's so we get Turkey in there largely because of the Byzantines, But then when we get, outside of the Byzantines, we get to Armenia, and it just consistently half in and half on the map. So if I were Armenian, I'd be a little bit frustrated too. Where am I? Am I on or off, for crying out loud? But he's always right. Right. Well, just to give some indication, right, what we're talking about, there's the Caspian Sea, here's the Black Sea, Mediterranean, of course, there's Turkey, and Armenia was this sort of elastical thing that grew and expanded over various times because, the flow of time in history. So at one moment it was this blue line, which was sort of more stable moment, and then as it began to be conquered from top and down, it sort of became over here, it drifted over here a little bit. So more or less the blue line is what we're talking about, which is the time period around 400 to 1000 BC, after Christ. So for about 600 years, this is the time period that they became Christian. They became Christian in the 4th century. In fact, were depending on how you count, the first or the second Christian official state before Byzantium, the Ethiopians being perhaps even earlier. All right. Now, to understand why all of a sudden this time period is important for them, we need to just sort of retreat a little bit here. So here we're looking at the period sort of at the end of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, Justinian and so forth, from period from 100 to 600. So the trading world, the world of people doing actually significant trade, went along the Silk Route, as we all know, that started or ended sort of in Chang'an, which was the largest city in the world with about 1.5 million people, gigantic metropole, right? And of course, Europe at this time was sort of off the map. It was sort of having a lot of struggles, as we know. It was in the quote-unquote Dark Ages. And so basically, Constantinople was the other pole, right? And then there was the southern route that went through Petra. We know why that's famous, precisely because it was the link to India. And India, in this time period, was making sort of tremendously important changes, and we'll refer back to that a little bit too. So it was beginning to sort of organize itself as sort of as a state, this new capital was built, and this becomes a type of circle here with its sort of flow into China. Okay, so that's sort of the situation, before I'm talking about. But then a few things happen that all go into the favor of the Armenians who are, they're a little bit off the beaten track here. You see the Silk Route all goes a little south and so forth like that. Well, one thing that happens is that the Taklamakan Desert, which is over here, anyway, you see it just above the Tibetan Empire, this gigantic, terrible desert, on the north and south sides of it, streams from the mountains, from the Himalayas would come down, and so you could hug the edges of this desert. and later Buddhist shrines would be coming along here, sort of defining that. So you could sort of hug the edges of this thing. Well, those water streams began to dry out, and the year 800 is known as a type of early global warming. And so with the drying up of the Taklamakan River, the Taklamakan became implausible. You couldn't even go through it or along it, around it. It was finished. The Silk Route died. Chang'an more or less was coming to an end. This gigantic city, half of it went under the sand. So this meant two things. One, you had to go south or north. Now, if you went north, you went to the Uyghur Khanates, who were really interesting types, sort of early sort of Mongolians. And they had the benefit that they could get on a horse and go straight across to the Caspian Sea and unload and come to Armenia, right? So that was they were the first sort of FedEx of the world, right? Rapid transport of silk, straight to the European consumers, right? So all of a sudden, you see here, all of Armenia is in the nub now of a new emerging sort of global position. It didn't do anything about it. It didn't advertise itself, and it didn't send out flyers. We'll be the best. It just happened that this is what the global problem. It didn't know anything about global warming, right? The other problem, of course, is that Islam was coming into shape. So in the early years of Islam, there were lots of fights and trouble and this and that. You're not going to have trade happening, especially in the early centuries of Islam. It was only once Islam began to be settled around 800 that they basically were able to take the trade to them. So between the year 500 and 700, there was a lot of disruption in the traditional trade route that went through Iraq and now Iran. And the other thing that was happening is that Europe was now becoming an emerging market, right? You got to remember, Europe was off the map globally. No one knew where Europe was if you were a trader, global trader in the year 600, right? But by 800, with Charlemagne and the Europeans sort of back on target, right, there was more energy. So there was a bigger sucking sound now taking place, going up into Europe. So you see, it was sort of like, not the El Nino, but the Gulf Stream or so forth, right? I mean, the things change, right, and these streams begin to change. So for a period of time between 600 and 800, there was sort of this disturbance, if you will, in the traditional flow of goods. And this disturbance really meant that Armenia was sitting pretty good. Everything had to go through Armenia, just like the FedEx has to go through Memphis, Tennessee. Now, of course, just to look a little bit ahead, by the time Islam comes online, so to speak, in the 9th century, they want to do everything in their power to get those Armenians, put them down a peg, and they do. So Armenia begins to sort of die off by in the 900, 1000. They're still there, but the Byzantines are now invading, and of course Islam takes them over. And the Islam makes a sort of, type of conceptual superhighway that goes from Cordova to here to sort of bind these cities together. And basically, the northern route is basically obliterated. So, well, of course, the consequence of that is the Mongolians, who had, for a while, remember that line here, right? Their line gets sort of taken away. And of course, they come back with a bloody vengeance, right? In the 1200, the Mongolians come on and just sort of take over that whole business. All right, but that's another fascinating story. We're not even going to get there yet. So here we are again, back around 600 in this sort of trading entrepot of Armenia. They're doing well. And what it means, of course, is they've got tons of money, right, to pay for buildings, right? Buildings that just are truly remarkable buildings. All right. Now, the thing is, these buildings have, for better or worse, one interesting feature about them. They are stone buildings, stone masonry buildings carved to a precision that is just totally remarkable. Now, of course, it comes out of the Hellenistic tradition, right? We all know the wonderful stonework of the Greeks, and we all know the wonderful stonework of the Hellenistic time. And this tradition basically continues on in Armenia, right? And this stone mason tradition. So if we ask ourselves, who else is doing this? Well, it's sort of not that clear if anybody else is doing it. The Armenians are doing dressed stone. But if you go south into the Sasanian world, they're doing mud brick. They put some pretty stones on the outside, but basically it's mud brick. In Egypt at the time, they're doing just mud brick. The Hagia Sophia is a magnificent building, there's no doubt, but it's a brick building. There's not a stone in it, right? Made of tiny little bricks. So if I'm talking about lecture about brick, I would talk about Hagia Sophia, but I'm talking about stone, right? It has stone foundations, but as soon as they get above, it's all brick. And of course, when we go into the Roman and European world, right, it's like rubble. Barely brick. All right, so this is a Sasanian hunting lodge. And we see it has some stones still attached to it in the front, but basically it's a mud brick building. Still there, wonderful building, beautiful symmetry and so forth and so on, right? But it's not a stone building. Okay, the Byzantines, of course, were making buildings that we know of this type of genre, right? With stone, brick, rubble, whatever's lying around. It's a nice building, and if I want to talk about Byzantine architecture, I would certainly admire it. But if I were an Armenian, I would look at this and go, "That's what?" Right? And then, of course, I go to England, and they do not too bad with some whatever stones are lying around. Small little windows. And in Russia, they're making wooden buildings. Wonderful buildings, but they're out of wood. And in India, they're making wooden buildings too, also fabulous and interesting, and we have to talk about that too, right? But they're wood, right? Okay. So here we are back in Armenia now, right? And we go to the Yereruk Basilica, and we look at this stuff, and we say, this is good. If I'm a stonemason, I'm happy, right? Beautiful, so it's still standing. It's so perfectly put together, it's still standing, right? Despite the troubles, the political troubles, and so forth and so on, right? Beautiful columns. There's no doubt that this is the embodiment of a type of Hellenistic tradition, right? And the plan, beautifully structured, simple, powerful plan, with this powerful and wonderful sort of stone masonry. In Europe, they had forgotten how to use concrete. It's very famous. They used concrete in the Roman times. And then they all forgot how to use it because, well, they didn't like science too much, in the early Christian era, concrete. So they forgot about how to use concrete, right? So the modern age, they were still using concrete. These are held together by porcelana concrete. So they didn't forget. I don't know. The guys in Rome forgot, but they didn't forget. Right? So they make these buildings. They're beautifully compact in design. Formally, there's a lot to discuss, and you can see still the remnants of type of classicizing, work. And they also introduce a component which becomes very significant, which is the dome. Now, the Byzantines, of course, had domes, but if you go to Hagia Sophia, you're not going to see the dome from outside. The dome is just, you just don't see it, right? It's sort of there, but it's sort of very low and embedded in the mass, right? The Byzantine domes are not visible as such because they're in a usually a sort of like a tower shape with a cone on top. But there now the dome, at least as a symbolic space, is sort of thrust through the building. And so we see, if you will, a new sort of paradigm of what the dome is meant to be and project as a sort of a representation of the divine cosmos, not just on the inside and underneath, but outside as an expression of the architectural element. So this all comes to a head in one of the great buildings, which is St. Spreme in Akhmiadzin in Armenia. The front business, this comes later, so you can sort of more or less forget that. But you see this really amazing building with the scalloped interiors, with the dome comes down, and it just, a tremendous relationship between the sort of geometry, the skill of the masons, the way, in some sense, the weight of this is dematerialized by these windows which are sitting under the dome, right, which is sort of a scary spot. The dome is coming down, pushing outwards, and there you make windows. So they'd already sort of been able to uncover that problem. You see the buttress piles here, which sort of hold the base of this. This is basically a counterweight, to the outward projections. So they're not making buttresses, but they've already understood the idea of how to stack up sort of the stone and make it into part of the sort of aesthetic language. Somewhat later structures that just sort of go to continuously remind us of the skill of this. So there are various sort of books on Armenian architecture, and they're all about the churches. Not too many books on Armenian, as I would like to think. But basically, the main story is about these churches. Now, if you go to Trachtenberg and Hyman, you'll discover that he talks about the French churches, and then talks to German churches, and then Italian churches, and then he gets to the ends of the map, and there's the Armenian churches. But the trouble is, these churches come historically first, right? We're talking 600, 700, 800, right? St. Michael's is sort of 1,000 something or other, right? So these are hundreds of years before the church, the stone churches of great quality become developed in Europe. And this, by the way, is a stone smelting plant. But the reason we're in Turkey now. This is Anis, which was the former capital, and there are only a few piddly little remnants of buildings left because all the stones were melted, burnt down basically to ash, and marketed for bricks. So this is one of the great tragedies of the modern times. I want to talk about that. Right. So here we are again, with this map, and we're looking at the world, and we're sort of wondering, if an atom bomb had happened to fall on Armenia around the year 400, what would happen to that know-how? What would happen to dressed stone? I don't know history would have been a little different, maybe. Well, we also know that when Islam came, there was this tremendous exodus, not only the people fleeing Islam, but people converting into Islam. We know that the caliphs in Baghdad brought Byzantine craftsmen to help produce certain buildings for him in Damascus and Baghdad. We know that there were Armenians brought to India in the Islamic. We know that there's a church in southern France which is built by Armenians because they say they are Armenians. They write it on the stone. We're a band of Armenian craftsmen, who left our home country building this church. And it looks very Armenian. I don't have a picture of it, just believe me. And we also know that German princesses had a fancy for Byzantine wives. And so the Byzantine wives would come up with their retinues of all their stuff into Germany, including craftsmen and architects, and most certainly brought in stonemasons along with them for the time. So from the year, let's say 600 AD here, this is, when you talk about stone architecture, that's sort of it. I mean, it's a small little world, right? But very quickly, by the time we get to the 9th century, we see a tremendous sort of flowing out of this sort of technology. Now, I'm not saying that this is all caused because Armenians built this. I'm saying that there's a relationship between, if you will, the survival of this technology and, in some sense, survivals and revivals that begin to take place, especially in India and Southeast Asia. Borobudur was built by architects and engineers who came from India, not by locals there. These guys developed schools of stone masonry. I was just visiting one in Chennai in southern India, which still exists on how to make these temples today, which sort of use certain ideas of geometry and precision and cutting and so forth. which began to develop, perhaps inspired, perhaps initiated by, whether it's survival or revival, we don't know. But certainly there's an uncanny project, right, of development of advanced stonework in the 8th century. Right? So that we can begin to sort of see this sort of space, right, which is the space of advanced stonework. And by the time we get to the Khmer, right, we're talking about really amazing and beautiful sort of stonework, far exceeding practically anything we want. So we go to India, and of course we can see traces of what, I don't know what we would call it. Calling it late Hellenism or Neo-Hellenism might be a bit sort of presumptuous because no one calls it that. But of course we can call it Indian architecture. But you know, there are columns and capitals, and there's edicule, and there's people standing in edicule. It looks sort of like something you might find in a Hellenistic spice. Of course, it's a different designing and different things. There's sort of things that look like volutes and dentils up there. And then we sort of see the emergence of sort of now freestanding Hindu architecture in 780 in Bhubaneswar. Just absolutely tremendous building. And it's sort of solid compactness, beautifully put together, precision detailing. Right? In other words, we don't have like you know, primitive ugly versions, better versions, a little bit better versions, a little bit better versions, and then this. Right? This is it. It just sort of comes here. So all of a sudden, in a very short span of year, a new technology appears and gets produced and understood and worked on to develop, if you will, also a new religion at that time, which was development of the Hindu spaces. And it goes down to Sri Lanka by 900, another one of these sort of absolutely spectacular structures. Borobudur, needless to say, is one of the great monuments sort of the world. Right? So while all of that was happening, this is what buildings look like in Greece, in Byzantium. Well, okay, is that all you can do? I don't know. I'm not going to put that in my book. You know, okay, yes, you know, I know it's a UNESCO site and everybody's happy, but you know, it means nothing to me. Now that's architecture, right? Now I'm looking, columns, there used to be a wooden roof here. So you see it's a corbelled roof, but it was hidden by a wooden teak roof. So look at these columns. Look at these detailing. I don't know. I mean, if you're a mason, you start, and this starts in the Angkor at 800, right? So now I'm not trying to put Europe down, but I'm just sort of saying, you know, if you want to do global, we got to be fair, you know, you know. And the reason we go to Angkor is not because it's sort of remote and distant and cute and wonderful and cuddly and, you know, exotic. It's because during this period between 600 to about 1,000, right, the entire West, Central, and Southeast Asia was undergoing an explosion of, if you will, architectural stone elegance. And we could easily, you know, begin to take students here and look at these details, and then go to India, because the masons and the technology that were built here all originated in India. Perhaps we could even go into Armenia. Perhaps we can even go further back. I don't know. We could do all sorts of interesting studies. Why is it not done? Is because the people who study Angkor, right, you know, will sort of say, well, we don't really know where it comes from. Well, that's sort of fair because we don't have the evidence. We don't have the guy saying, you know, I'm from here or there. But clearly, we can begin to sort of map out certain potential global realities, despite our sort of fears that we're insulting the Cambodian scholars by saying that this is part of an Indianization project. Right? Or in Bhopal. All right. So this would be a piece of sort of the global history, right? A chunk of how we can see Armenia not as sort of the perimeter and the weird thing at the edge of Europe, right? But it has another edge condition, which is sort of, it's the edge of Southeast Asia, right? This is sort of an amazing happening place in architecturally language, right? From 700 to the year 1000. Hundreds of temples get built, all really significant and important and beautiful, right? And Armenia now has a piece of that. It may not have been the determining piece, but it certainly was a player in, if you will, this type of world. So we're looking at Armenia in the wrong part of the globe. We're looking at it as an afterthought in the Christian religious world, a European world, when we should be seeing it really in a much more global perspective as part of the Hindu world. But it's not going to happen. right? If you get books out on Indian architecture, they're not going to tell you this story. They're going to talk about Indian architecture and how it had thousands and thousands of years of Indian history and how it all sort of came up like a tree and blah, blah, blah. You know. And then if you go to Iran, they're going to tell you the Iranian society went thousands of years and all these people by themselves invented all these amazing things. And same thing with Cambodia. Cambodia, thousands of years and all these people made it. You know. It's just not true. That doesn't mean that people made things by themselves, but there was continuously an intermixing and interrelationship, for better or worse, of different ideas and technologies. We can emphasize the singularity of history if we want, or we can begin to emphasize the non-singularities. And I'm just really interested in these sort of non-singularities. But so much of history is about these sort of silos of reality. Now, in the old days, this was how the silos worked out. You had Egypt, China, and India, and the pre-Columbian. 4 silos, pretty simple. Okay. Today, I didn't even put all the silos, so just sort of show you a lot of silos, right? The Indian story, the Cambodian story, the Ethiopian story, the Russian story, and right? Lots of silos. You know, each nation has its own sort of silo of history that it wants you to know. Right? And then you go, of course, into the new genre of national histories, which are all also come out of the 19th century, starting with the British Museum, which have sort of its silo, right? And now everyone wants to be like the British Museum, of course. You know, so the Korean Museum, the Chinese Museum, the American Museum, the Mexican Museum, the Venezuelan Museum, and so forth and so on. All have their national stories to tell us. So if you add to the silos, which is sort of the art historical world of these silos, and you add all the national museums telling you that how each country goes from sort of 0 to 100, and then you add to that World Heritage sites, because each country wants to have its own World Heritage site, to show, you know, that is really important and has these great artifacts that it sort of can take care of now. You get basically just this almost an infinite variety, if you will, of silos that don't touch each other. So these discourses are built around sort of mutual exclusion. So I'm sorry, it's not global. It may do a lot, and we may have to go. I may have to read lots of stuff, you know, to get to that person and get to that this and this and this. But this is not global history. It just can't be. It just, in fact, I think it's sort of the opposite of what global history should be. And the worst comes to worst. I'm just sort of picking on this a little bit, but it has a, this is just because I happened to be there for its opening. They invited me to talk, right? And, you know, I sort of complained. I said, you know, you have these 2 museums. One is the Museum for the Permanent Exhibition of Traditional Art. Now, okay, I'm worried. What is traditional? How far back does that go? Why does traditional sort of end, you know, always with modern? I mean, traditional sort of ends. You get a book on, you know, on Islamic architecture, it'll end, you know, around 1750. And you get a book on Korean art and architecture, it'll end around 1800 or whatever it is. You know. And then, so that's traditional, permanent, right? And then we got a Linnaeum Company, another museum. This was designed by Rem, and that's why I was there. Flow. Right? You see the flow of modern. So Rem got the Flow building. I'm not showing you the building. You can imagine it. Right? And Botha got the permanent building. I mean, you know. And Botha, you know, talked. He said, you know, I'm giving, you know, the reason I designed this building is because in the great cathedrals of Europe, we understand permanence. Okay, I mean, the Koreans really like that. Okay, so I mean, you know, it's like, why didn't he talk about Koreans' permanence? I mean, why does the European permanence is sort of always the model, you know? And then, of course, Rem stands there, well, you know, the flow of the buildings on this and that. So this is what they got now. You know, they got a split personality. History stops here, and no history continues on. So we're in the no history, and we look back at history, which is stiff, silo-like, stable, stationary, produced by art historians who are going to tell you that the Koreans are vastly different from the Chinese, from the Mongolians, from this and this and this and this and whatnot. Well, it's just, you know, I'm very worried about this because this has become an international pathology that is sort of disrupting our capacity to think cross these national boundaries. So my 2 little points at the end are, as we become more global, traditions become more static, and this is a fallacy of tremendous devastating importance, I mean, or consequence, I think, for us. You know, as we begin to fetishize traditions and make them ever more stationary. So I argue that the more global we become, the more we should struggle to really define global history. Thank you very much.
Mark, we have a few minutes for questions. Questions, Mark?
I'll jump in. And I find my own research interests are tracking. I would say my own research interests are tracking with those that motivate some of your framework, and it's certainly, I feel like the imperative today is not necessarily the same one, the referendum on modernism that you identified in these the early case studies, the Trachtenberg and the Crouch and so forth. But now we have a different set of imperatives, and you've written the book to serve them in this new myth of markets as the driving forces of architectural of history and of architecture. And I'm a fervent subscriber to the myth. The way you've presented it makes suggests that you might have some interesting comments about what might be occluded by our new mythology that you're writing.
Yeah, well, so there are two questions. I mean, one is, of course, we have our own idea fixes that we want to project. And there is no, that's why I said at the beginning, and there's no thing as a global history. But there are approximations, if you will. And I think we can, if we identify many of our past mistakes and try to sort of avoid some of them, we are stepping into certain types of territories that maybe we don't know exactly what the methodological approach might yet be. And we probably will make a whole bunch of new mistakes, that's for sure. But at least we're going somewhere. And if we go towards, I think, a type of seeing the globe without its national boundaries, which is the first thing. It's really hard for us. It's ironic that as an historian, when you begin to do research at this level, what you encounter in 99% of the world is the solidity of the national structures in which we have. And we've got to remember, nationhood is itself a modern thing, right? It comes from the Treaty of Vienna of 1814, which I don't know, you should all, of course, know all about, which no one ever does. It basically said that each nation has the right to stable nations, and it has the right to autonomy in its own perimeter and so forth, and that's why the Europeans, didn't have Napoleon anymore. They just came up with the EU later, but but everywhere in the world they wanted to do that. Right? So this is part of the thing. So if we work without that, then all of a sudden other types of softnesses can potentially come in, which is like the vernacular, which other things, which could replace that with another type of strange political reality. I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly. And then of course there's the globalization economy project, which, all of us, because simply by what we wear and what we're using to communicate, right, are participating in global one way or the other, either as a participant or as a consumer. And this gives us the illusion that somehow we know what's on the other side of the horizon, which is a complete fantasy. As we become more global, we're becoming, in fact, more and more ignorant, if you will, of what it means to be global. And this sort of really concerns me. And I think architects have a different position than art history. I'm not trying to pick on art historians here, but I think architects have a slightly different position because our discipline of architectural history is a little bit underdetermined compared to art history. And so we also have architects who can go out in the field and do research, whereas my art historian friends, couldn't send a bunch of artists to Angkor. What would they do, right? But if I had 20 students, there's no section through Angkor Wat, the famous temple. There's no section through it. Now, how can I teach, architecture of one of the great buildings of all time without showing a section? Right. So what I want to do is take my 20 students, and we can do it with electronic measurements, and probably in 2 days we'll have the section done. But no one has ever done it. So I can do that, so to speak, as an architect. I can still go out there and actually do research, in a funny way, in the global thing, right? As opposed to many art historians who are sort of stuck in a sort of a contemporary versus history polemic. I'm trying to avoid architectural history from getting stuck in this sort of it's all history or it's all contemporary project, which I think would be the end of all of it. Then we're doomed.
I was wondering actually, how does
the global project put in question those art historical categories, especially, say, the periods, say the Baroque, the Renaissance, etc. So as we know more about various cultures, but as we know more the relationship between these cultures, do you think that that can change the relatively stable categories that we're used to use in art or architectural history?
Oh, it should. I think it should change. I mean, I think Baroque and Renaissance are pretty fixed, and they're sort of so European, it's going to be hard to change those. But other categories, which might be more elastic, Gothic, for example, we know there was Arabic influence came from the southern Mediterranean, that was brought in by the Normans. There might have been, once again, for the German architects and the Romanesque, they're Byzantine and Armenian architects sort of came north. So there, we're all of a sudden talking an encounter with the global thing. Certainly will force us to sort of think both directions, right, as opposed to just identifying certain particular styles. Certainly how these styles operate outside of Europe, that's completely taboo. I mean, one should never talk, really, I think, about a classical phase in Gupta architecture. I mean, I just sort of have a lot of problem with those types of terminologies.
I really loved the talk, by the way. Enlightening for me in all sorts of ways. One thing that really struck me, and this is kind of a maybe crass hypothesis, but that what you're doing might be called eco-history, economic and ecological mapped onto one another. And that started me thinking about sort of rates of change and how there's something particularly appropriate here for architecture as opposed to other historical subjects, in that rates of climate change and rates of technological change in architecture proceed similarly slowly, and that's a very different understanding of history than I got as an architecture student, where you had a sense that there were these periods where things got really fast. The Renaissance, everything got really fast. 20th century, everything got really fast. And this sort of levels out, 5,000 years to think of architectural history very much the same way we might think about, climatology or something like that, or history of climatology.
Well, as it turns out, I mean, we didn't anticipate this, how important climate was in these stories. I mean, no one ever mentioned that to me when I was a student, I mean, you had this, but when we began to, and the guys who studied the Taklamakan Desert, they're not thinking about the Silk Route or about Armenia. I mean, they're doing the stories in the city of the death of the Taklamakan Desert. So we did a lot of reading, and talking to these guys, because then you say, well, that's happening in 800, then it's clear there are certain consequences now in terms of sort of a civilizational project, right? And of course, an architectural project is a direct consequence of all of that too. So yeah, part of the globe is understanding its climate, the geopolitical issues that are at stake, to try to relate the big picture issue, to then the building. And that's the hard part. I mean, because you can take the big picture, but then how do you get to the building? I mean, this is the thing. And that's always a tricky thing. And that's, where we pick the buildings that we thought fit best. Someone else could have picked other buildings. People complained we didn't have enough this or didn't have that. We tried our best. I mean,
Thanks, Mark. I have a question to follow up on Jonathan's question. It seems to me what you're describing is a kind of operative history, the way Tafuri described an operative criticism. Are we seeing a kind of shift where operative history is somehow relying on the archaeologist, the way the critic was relying on the historian in Tafuri's model? I mean, because your response about the measuring of the buildings and so forth, it seemed to me that there's a kind of archaeological privileging that might have been a historical privileging, in the Tafurian sense.
That's right, yeah. In terms of the origin story, right? I mean, we're talking about privileging a new generation archaeologists, not the old generation, the Dinsmore crowds who, would give you boring facts and, they just discovered, they had discovered it in 1910 or 1920, but no one really thought too much of it. So now they're re-excavating a site in northern Egypt and the delta, on the delta, which was a Doric era site made for Greeks, where the Greeks were brought down there to chisel stone little statuettes for the religious market. So they made thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands little like souvenirs, basically. So the souvenir market was already big for the Egyptians back then. And this was around the year 600 BC or so, before the Greeks were doing stone buildings. So we know that there's this Greek colony there. We know that there were the Greeks. We know that they had their own culture. And right down the road was one of the gigantic temples of all time, which it doesn't exist anymore, it's been destroyed. And so they're thinking, well, now this is sort of interesting. These Greeks come down there, they see stones, they've seen stones being made, stones being carved, stones being chiseled. They go, why don't we do that? Right. So now that guy's argument is that these guys saw, this is what helped them make the transition from wood into stone, was actually seeing it in firsthand in their little village crafts town, right? And then they went back, and then that explains the suddenness, if you will, of the transition. So this is a new archaeological thinking, right? It was discovered, 30 years ago, but then, what? Meaningless, right? It's not relevant really to anything. Today they're saying this is really hugely relevant, right? Because we're thinking, if you will, in this sort of type of global relationships. So these are sort of examples of how archaeology itself has started to rethink this. So certainly operative, I would say in some sense, you're right. I mean, but also sort of operating still with and around, because some archaeologists are still operating in their own national little bubbles, and clearly do globally, you can't do that. You have to respect it, but you can't just Xerox copy their world, because then you're just back where you were in the 19th century.
Thank you for the talk. On this slide, you say as we become more global, but your whole talk was that we never stopped being global. And like in Japan, it was so global that they had to consciously close the port for 200 years so that they can be, as anal as they wanted to be or something. But anyway, so the demarcation of the countries, the nations, was a political project. And now we are okay with global. That means I'm suspicious that it's also a political project, that we want to promote it for some reason or the other, and that makes me suspicious. And what do you think is the danger as we embrace the global, and your work might be worked against you for those reasons?
That's right, yeah. Global is not a univalent type of project. In other words, I think there's a resistance to a certain global within the global, if you will. In other words, the traditional distinction between I don't like the global, I'm going local. I'm arguing also against that. Right. Of course, I go to my farmer's market and I do enough local. I mean, I'm not saying I eat kiwis every day. But the traditional idea that global and local are two polarities, I think, is wrong. Right. This is sort of the mythology that we have. Right. Basically, what we got is many locals, if you will. Let's say it's meaning nations, right, becoming sort of essentializing themselves sort of historically. Both as a bulwark against, if you will, the flattening of contemporary culture, which is sort of a good, it's sort of like the natural response. We don't want to be everybody, we want to have our own identity. But the consequence of that is a type of internalization of the identity project that is reinforced by representations in museum and in history and so forth like that. So a lot of this research, which is really good because we have the new archaeological sites being uncovered, some of it actually is very productive. But we have to be, if we want to do then the global project this way I see it, we have to be also suspicious of that project, because that's very isolationist in principle. And that's not going to get us to think beyond the horizon. Global has to sort of accept the fact that there's realities beyond the horizon that impact us. And that history starts very clearly in 3000 BC. And I'm not sure about before then, but absolutely about 3000 BC. So horizon thinking is really always there, you know. And I think that's sort of the type of history I'm trying to sort of get at. And I think students can see that. I mean, students, you know, if we just give them the Indian history or the Japanese history in one, and we're done, right? And we don't mention Japanese and the Korean Buddhism that came into Japan, or if we don't show flows and realities, you know, we're doing a disservice, because our world is also flowing in a particular way. But it's not the flow in opposition to tradition. It's not that's the new polemic, if you will, that is all flow today and no flow in the past. You see, I think it's almost like the other way now. I thought there's a lot of flow in the past, and today, where people say flow, I'm skeptical. I'm seeing a lot of not flow. We can make, you know, buildings that do the flow, right? No flow off this place. But conceptually and politically, in our history, we're not doing flow. We have flow in capital. There's no one going to deny that, right? But I think, you know, we need to sort of ask how the history is sort of stuck at the moment, I think, in a sort of a ambivalent spot. And the last thing we need to do is sort of see history as sort of stationary up until recently. I think that would be really not good.
In terms of changes over time in how architecture has gone, in terms of how architecture has gone from being the project of a civilization to the projects of one person, and how it's become, the niches in architecture have become so much smaller. Do you find it easier or harder to put things in a global, big picture perspective in terms of how it's changed over time? Do you think it's easier now that we can see all those changes from more detail, or do you think it was easier in the past?
Well, that's a good question. Probably it's easier in the past because you just have more time to think about it, you know, because it's hard for us to see ourselves in that sense. But the architecture always had a particularly privileged spot in society, whether it was by one person or two people or a group of stonemasons, you know. In other words, if we think of Saint Espreme, and we think, you know, that was done by the Frank Gehry of his age. I mean, that, you know, is a type of equation I would like to sort of almost see, so that we don't sort of put it into sort of some sort of mystical, organic relationship to past, right? It was a power statement, right? It was the Bilbao of that age. It was meant to project, and we don't have the buildings at all. I mean, all we have is left is the building today. But it was on this gigantic platform, and there were walls around it, there was monasteries around it. It was a gigantic thing, you know. And it was clearly one of the great edifices of the time. Or Hagia Sophia, which was, you know, that was another, you know, Bilbao of that age, you know, so to speak, you know. So buildings always projected, and they projected over their own sort of cultural horizons as well, in that sense. So I don't know if that exactly explains it, but somewhere in the middle, I would say, is where I would sort of try to put my answer.
Okay, we should wrap up. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you very much for coming.